Hi, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about Chapter 6, Research Ethics. So research ethics is such an important topic that all researchers need to know about and think about before they have even crafted a research proposal or began conducting research. It's also something important for all of us to know as we interact with research on a daily basis. So it's important to know what some of the ethical principles are, and also to make sure that we are being critical consumers of the research that we engage with. So the fundamental principle that we have in research ethics is ensuring no physical or psychological harm to participants. And beyond that, participants, but also their communities that might be impacted as well. So when we talk about research ethics, we are talking about the guiding principles that researchers hold to make sure that they are not causing harm, primarily for participants, but then also upholding integrity and validity in their research and maintaining trust with the public about their research. So in the text, you are going to read about the relationship between society and science, some considerations about researchers having professional conduct as they engage in research, and then most importantly, how to ensure the ethical treatment of research participants. So when we talk about how ethical approaches are determined, we are drawing from the philosophy as it relates to ethics. So in the text, we talk about three different philosophical approaches to ethics. There are more, but these are some to consider. So the first being the deontological philosophical approach to ethics, which is the idea that there are universal ethical codes that apply to all people in all situations in all time. So some of these, an example of this would be that murder is always unethical. So these deontological ethical principles, again, they apply to every situation. Now, a different ethical approach is ethical relativism, which means that ethical decisions are guided by the culture and the context that dictates the norms, the societal norms at the time. So that is another approach. And then finally, utilitarianism, which focuses on balancing the benefits with the costs to make sure that the benefits outweigh the costs. So I am curious, which of these would you say most guides your ethical compass, your moral compass, or are there certain situations where you fall in the deontological realm, or the ethical relativism realm, or the utilitarianism realm? So when we are doing our educational research methods, ethics, in general, they follow this guidelines of the benefits must sufficiently outweigh the cost or the harms. So here you can see in this visual, we are balancing the benefits of the study and the costs. And as you can see here, the benefits to participants, the advancement of science, knowledge, improvement, outweigh the potential harm to participants. And every study has potential harms or costs to participants. You can see some examples here. The time that participants give to participate in the study is a cost that they are giving. Time required, perhaps expense, could be a difficult topic for participants to talk about, so that could cause some harm too. In general, in education, the harms tend to be less severe than in other disciplines such as medical research, but it is still really important to think about those in education as well. So when we think about the relationship between society and science, I think it's really important to think about the power that researchers have. Researchers are conducting research to try to add to our understanding, to our body of knowledge on a particular topic. And so that's a great responsibility, because it is a very powerful position to be in. And so researchers, even from the very beginning, when they generate their research question, they are having a ethical decision there about what topic is important and worthy of research and which are not. And so that is something that comes up when we are thinking about the ethics and the relationship between society and science, is thinking about which societal concerns are worthy of research and to what extent should social and cultural values drive research, who should decide what research is funded and conducted. And so this is something that we definitely see in terms of the political climate dictating what research is funded, and that leads to practice. We definitely see that in education. An example would be the uptick in standardization, standardized tests, and the push towards data-driven decision-making, and some of the types of research that are valued and funded in education over others. So it's important that researchers be critical about this and think about this when they are choosing their topic to make sure that it's advancing knowledge and having a positive impact on society and not excluding topics that are also important as well and are perhaps understudied. So, of course, researchers need to have a high degree of integrity, professional integrity when it comes to conducting their research to avoid any instances of research misconduct, because research misconduct can have a significant harm on society. So some examples of these are fabrication, making up results, falsifying results, manipulating data, or falsifying an element of it, and then of course plagiarism, using another's work without credit. So thinking about this is something that is of the utmost importance because it can have serious ramifications for society. I wanted to share this article that my dad just sent to me recently about ethical misconduct in medical research involving Alzheimer's. And so this article is based on a book that the author is doing about some of the falsified results in Alzheimer's research and the legacy of that and how that has led to some false theories and a lot of understudied issues in Alzheimer's that of course affects a lot of people. So that is one example if you want to check that out in medicine. So in education, we have the American Educational Researchers Association has a set of guidelines to help guide us in how to conduct research involving people or human participants. So one of them is professional competence, that researchers are expected to only conduct research in the areas of their expertise, making sure that they have integrity in all of their interactions, this idea of non-malfeasance, not doing harm, respecting people's rights, dignity, and also diversity and valuing cultural diversity, and upholding social responsibility to promote justice and fairness, benefits. And especially in education, because much educational research is conducted with children or other vulnerable groups, it's even more important to keep those principles in mind. So one of the ways that researchers ensure that they have ethical treatment of participants is through informed consent. And informed consent is before participants begin participating in the study, the researcher is expected to inform them about the study, tell them about the study's purpose, procedures, how they will protect their confidentiality, and then let the person decide if they want to participate or not. So with this informed consent, it's important that the purpose is clearly outlined and that it is at an appropriate comprehension level for the age or the intellectual ability of the participants, so they are not being coerced into participating. It's also important that participants know that it's totally voluntary if they want to participate and that they're not coerced into participating. Now, informed consent is for adults. So minors, they require parental consent. And in those cases, the children assent after the parent has consented for them. In most cases, informed consent is considered active consent. And this is when it is a written document that the researcher reads to the participant, they read through it and they sign it. There's also another type of consent called passive consent, where the participant is informed that the study is happening and that they are enrolled, and they are assumed to have consented unless they explicitly decline. Now, in most cases, active consent is expected. And so in the cases where passive consent are being used, the researcher needs to demonstrate a good reason for why, and the IRB needs to approve that. And another important principle is the idea of freedom to withdrawal. Ethically, participants are able to withdraw from the study at any time while the study is being conducted. So even after they've started participating, they can still withdraw. And maybe after they've finished their interview, they can still withdraw. And it is the researcher's responsibility to make sure that participants understand that. And also that the participant is not feeling the effects of contextual pressure. So particularly in education, it's common for teachers to want to have their students be their research participants, or maybe a principal have their teachers be research participants. But when there is a relationship like that, it could lead to participants feeling like they have to participate or there will be a potential risk to them. And so in those instances, the researcher needs to demonstrate that they are taking measures to ensure that participants know there will be no ill effect on them if they decide not to participate. And so that is normally done in the informed consent, and researcher would have to demonstrate what they are going to do to make sure that there's no potential risks and that the participant knows that. Now, some other important terms in terms of ethical research has to do with deception and debriefing. So I mentioned in the informed consent, the researcher needs to tell the participant what the purpose of the study is. Well, in some cases, if the researcher tells the participant what the purpose is, it might ruin the results. And so in instances like that, where the benefit of using deception outweigh the risks, and if it wouldn't cause a lasting harm, the IRB will oftentimes improve deception. So an example of deception might be, let's say that the researcher is interested in which students get called on most in class. And so if the researcher tells the teacher, oh, we want to know, do you call on the students sitting in the front more than the students sitting in the back, or the students who have this type of personality more than the others, then that teacher will probably be biased and start to do that more. So they might tell the teacher, oh, we're looking at your student engagement. And then after the study, they would go through a debriefing process. So after a study is completed, if the researcher used deception, they are expected to debrief, and they go through what we call dehoaxing, which is when you inform participants about the true purpose of the study if you use deception. Now, debriefing is also important in studies that involve sensitive information. If participants are talking about a topic that's particularly emotional or traumatic for them, it's important that, of course, they know what it's about in that case and they've agreed to participate. But even though informed consent has been gained, it's important that the researcher at the end debrief with the participant to help alleviate any stress that was caused by participating. So in order to ensure that researcher is not doing harm, we have institutional review boards, or IRBs. And these are at universities or other institutions that are conducting research. And the whole purpose of the board is to review research proposals and approve or give corrections to studies before they begin, to make sure that all research that's being conducted at that institution is upholding ethical standards and not causing harm to participants. So Georgia State does have its own IRB. Now for this class, you don't need to get IRB because we are not going to be recruiting participants or carrying out the study, but you would need to get IRB if you plan on carrying out a study for the purposes of publishing it, or for instance, maybe a dissertation. So this is our IRB having to do with human subjects. I think I mentioned that I prefer participants over subjects, but our IRB says human subjects. And as you can see, they have all their forms and documents, and also the required training, which is the city training, which we are all doing this semester. So it's also important too, if you are asked to participate in a study, that you make sure that the researchers have IRB approval and that they get your informed consent. So these are some terms that you will see in the informed consent and in research. And I often see a little bit of confusion between these words. So I want to make sure that you pay special attention to these terms in the chapter and the city training to make sure that you understand the differences between them. So the idea of privacy and confidentiality are really important in protecting the rights of research participants. Now, privacy has to do with keeping the person's identity private and then also their data and the information that they share with you. So the researcher has the responsibility to keep their information private, their data private, all of their data from their phone number to their if it's interview responses, if it's their test scores, keeping that information private and in a password protected and encrypted source to make sure that it cannot be accessed. And that's definitely something that is even more important as our data is even more vulnerable in a lot of instances. Now, the two that I see confused a lot is confidentiality versus anonymity. And both confidentiality and anonymity have to do with protecting the identity of participants, but there is a key difference. So confidentiality is when the researcher knows who the participant is. So for instance, let's say that I was interviewing my students about their experiences in an online course. So if I had IRB approval and if I got your informed consent and you agreed to participate and I interviewed you, I would know your identity. However, I would keep your identity confidential. So when I published the study, I would use a pseudonym instead of actual names. And I would also make sure to blind the data so that way there was no identifiable information. So I wouldn't say Georgia State because that might give it away. I wouldn't say your school name because that might give it away. I would use general terms like a southeastern city. You will see that sometimes in studies that pseudonyms have been used and the identifiable information has been blinded to make sure that someone reading the report could not figure out the identity of the participant. So confidentiality does protect the privacy of participants, but the researcher knows who the participants are. And in education, oftentimes confidentiality is used because the researcher does know the identity of participants. Now, anonymity is when the researcher does not know the identity of the participant. They don't even know who it is. And so you will hear this a lot, like oftentimes in medical research, a double-blind study. So depending on the type of study, this is possible to have anonymity, but certain types of data, it would be impossible, like an interview study. So make sure that you know the difference between these, and in your research proposal, when you talk about ethics, make sure that you are being clear about which one you are proposing and why. So this week, you are also going to be doing the city training, the group 2 social and behavioral, which goes through a lot more detail about the ethical considerations. It is the training for the Georgia State IRB, and it's also used at a lot of other institutions as well. So it talks about some ethical dilemmas in research with participants, talks about the history of research ethics and some of the major cases that led to the principles that we have today, and helps you apply them to real world scenarios, and also some decision making, especially in cases involving vulnerable groups like children or prisoners. Another ethical concern in research is making sure that you are ethical in how you report research, that authors are receiving credit, and that there is not plagiarism being used. The authors of our text suggested using turnitin.com to make sure you're not accidentally plagiarizing. And we are going to be using APA style in this course. So making sure that you are using either quotation marks if it's a short quote or a block quote if it's more than 40 words. So another concept that when it comes to ethics in research, and this is something that's come up in the comments already in this course, is researcher bias and what researchers can do to address bias in research to make sure that it's not causing harm, because bias can certainly cause harm. And so one concept that I want to talk about is researcher positionality. And this has to do with all of the multifaceted aspects of our identity that researchers bring to their research. This is our race, our gender, our sexuality, age, socioeconomic status, region, occupation, religion, all of these different aspects of our identity. Those impact our perspective and the vantage point that we come to the research. They even shape the research topic that we're interested in, and so that has an impact as well. And so because all researchers are come into it with their own identity, that's why, in my opinion, research is not neutral, because it is all impacted by the impact of positionality. And so it's important for researchers in being ethical is to be reflective about their positionality, the different aspects of their identity, and how those experiences might shape their interactions with participants and their research and how they interpret the results. So that's really important to keep in mind and to reflect about in order to address bias. And it might seem counterintuitive, but a great way to address bias is to lean into it and to think about what about yourself might lead to a certain perspective and be transparent about that to communicate that you are thinking about it. And so readers can keep that in mind as well. And we'll talk more about this as well. So that's why I say that being aware of your biases is also important for ethical research. And instead of trying to be non-neutral, to always be reflective and aware of it, to understand the impact that your identity has on the research being conducted. Now, in the city training, also in the text, you will see several examples of research that has been unethical and has had a lasting impact on our society. So I want to end this lecture talking about one that has a lasting impact on our society, that is something that everyone should know about. And that is the U.S. Public Health Services syphilis study that was conducted for 40 years. So this study began in 1932, and the purpose of the study was to understand how syphilis impacted people. So the researchers wanted to study people who had syphilis to see how the disease impacted them and how they essentially declined over time with this disease. And so right from the beginning, the study had ethical issues because the participants that they enrolled were in no way treated fairly. So there was no informed consent. And in fact, the participants that were enrolled were not told the real purpose of the study. And also the researchers preyed on a vulnerable group. So the study enrolled 399 Black men with syphilis, and there was a total of about 600 Black men who were enrolled, about 4 of them who had syphilis at the time of the study, the rest were the control group. But these men most of them were sharecroppers. This was in rural Alabama, and most of them had very limited access to healthcare. And so they were coerced into the study by given incentives, like told that they would be given medical treatment, told that they would be given care when really that wasn't true. So there was a lack of informed consent. A vulnerable group was preyed upon by researchers, and also there was a high degree of deception. And that is because the men thought that they were being treated, but in fact, they were not. And this was even more pronounced about 10 years into the study when penicillin was discovered as a treatment for syphilis. So the participants in the study were not told about penicillin. They thought that they were being treated, but they weren't. And also the health professionals in the area, Tuskegee University, were told not to treat them as well. So the study participants were not told about this. So this study went on for nearly 40 years before a reporter found out about it and reported it in the Associated Press. It was published in 2 major publications. And so this led to widespread awareness that this was happening and criticism, which led to the study ending, thankfully. However, the study did have lasting effects. So of these participants, 128 of them died, 40 spouses were affected, and so were 19 children affected. So here we're talking about deaths. However, beyond the deaths, this study had widespread impact on not only the participants, their families, but the surrounding community. And so because of this study, this is one of the studies that led to, and this is not the only study, unfortunately, that had such predatory and harmful practices, particularly against Black Americans in the United States. But this study is one that led to the publishing that you'll learn about in the city training. The 1979 Belmont report was published that had some of the ethical principles that we still use today. There was also a $10 million judgment to participants and their families. But one of the main issues that came out of this study was a serious mistrust in researchers and in the medical profession, because once this study became widely known, of course, people were rightly concerned about it, but it still has lasting effects today. Oh no, I wanted to share this study with you. Let me get the link. Okay, I got the link. So some researchers at Stanford University are studying, they have a current study going where they are considering the longitudinal impacts of the United States syphilis study that was conducted at Tuskegee, Alabama, and how it still impacts communities today. So let's take a look at their research.
And I'm a physician here in the Oakland community, and I do clinical research.
My name is Marcella Alshon. I'm an assistant professor at CHP Corps, and I have a background in both medicine and economics.
I'm Javarsi. I'm a sophomore here at Stanford. Most likely majoring in biology, but currently expecting to go to med school.
We started a pilot study, which is examining some of the factors that get Black men in particular to seek preventative health care.
This notion that trust is important, trust in institutions is very important. I think that's very relevant, and it takes a long time to build it back up.
And one of the big factors are historical abuses. And the most well-known and probably the most egregious historical abuse is the U.S. Public Health Service study of syphilis around Tuskegee, Alabama.
And what had happened was for 4 decades, from 1932 to 1972, they specifically targeted Black men in the South who had very little education and followed them even though they had a treatment for syphilis and watched them as the disease progressed.
One of the big things I remember always being emphasized growing up is the huge gap in life expectancies between African American populations and Caucasian populations, specifically between white and Black men.
It had been written about for a long time that might have actually had an effect on the trust that particularly those men had in the institutions of public health, in medicine. We just took that hypothesis seriously, And we dug around, myself and my co-author, Marianne Wanamaker from the University of Tennessee, to actually see if that hypothesis held water. And we found that it did.
So those are some of the things we're trying to determine. What are the real factors behind African American male mistrust or distrust of the healthcare system? So we first started working in barbershops, and we went to barbershops to recruit black men. If you know anything about the black barbershop, everyone, if you need to get your hair cut and you're a black guy, whether you're rich or poor, a PhD, or didn't finish high school, you go to the same barbershop that is part of your community.
I think as the black barbershop, we're somewhat looked to as a pillar of the community. So we take on the responsibility of helping the black man's well-being.
I would definitely say I love my experience in a barbershop. I think one thing that I really got a feel for is like the many facets of the communities, especially specifically the even African American male communities within Oakland.
One thing we learned was just how much weight the Stanford brand has, and how I think happy people were that we were interested and involved with their struggles.
We have limited access to healthcare opportunities.
We would really leave this kind of bubble that we're in and really go down and see some of the challenges people were facing financially, economically, socially.
Me personally, I've had bad experiences with the medical system, with the criminal justice system. So a few years ago I was shot, and I wasn't necessarily treated the way that I would have liked, right? One thing that I noticed and one thing that I didn't see is people that look like me, and which instantly put me in a state of vulnerability.
Because a lot of minorities, they don't seek health care for many reasons, whether they're scared and they just don't know. But with me being in the face of the shops, recruiting is kind of like, oh hey, this guy, it's just kind of like, it's a connection.
This is a bigger problem than just in my community, because throughout this research project, we were able to meet folks from Africa, we were able to meet folks from different states, and it's a common problem throughout this nation, right, throughout the world.
So Dr. Alston and I hope to uncover a few things. One, what are some of the factors that either get black men to seek preventative health care, or to prevent them from seeking preventative health care? So if we know that, if we look at the positive side, we can maybe impact policy or work with institutions like a Stanford or a Sutter Health to design systems that reinforce some of those positive aspects.
So I share that because you can see so many different aspects of issues that we are talking about, not only this week, but throughout the course. So in this study, you can see the researchers talking about some of the past unethical treatment of participants. And then also you see them conducting research that is trying to do good and help people. You can see them talking about how they recruited participants. You could see them talking to participants and then talking about how they had a hypothesis and how that led to their study and what they're finding and what they are hoping will come out of their study. So as we close out for today, I want you to think about ethics, not just about rules, but having respect for all people's dignity and their rights, making sure that research is protecting the identity of participants, is valid and maintains public trust and respect for all communities, that informed consent is a pillar of research, that it must be got, and that participants, their personal information must be kept private, and that they must have freedom to withdraw if they so decide. And so as we close out today, it's important for you to start thinking about your research topic, your potential research question, and how ethical principles might apply to your research proposal, and how you might go about ensuring ethical standards in your research proposal. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts, ideas, and questions in the chat.